We are at one of those extraordinarily rare moments, and this is going to sound like hyperbole, but I'm absolutely sincere, in the evolution of humanity. And it is humanity's ability to master technology. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of simple. First, I'm going to start with before the creation of humanity. I said I'm going to cover everything. I'm going to go pretty quickly about the Big Bang and the first 13.8 billion years. And I'm going to kind of pick up at that point, 2.5 million years ago. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the nearer history, about humankind and the use of calculating, computing. And then focus even more tightly on how we got where we are today, and I don't mean through the rain, I just mean as a species. And then I'd like to give you a hint as to what I think the future is going to be. It's going to have to be, in fact. I'll also mention what others think it is, and they're very different answers. I had the pleasure to talk to a few of our students the other day, and they asked me a question, which is always a mistake, because I'll give an answer. And we talked a little bit about this. And it was amazing. You know, it's wonderful talking to young people, and I see some of them in the audience. It's actually very wonderful, because the millennials, I think they're millennials, right? The millennials don't have a thought in their head. They're in no way biased by prior knowledge. Now our job is to fix that a little bit. But they're much more enjoyable to talk to than talking to any of my colleagues, all of whom have opinions. And worse than that, all of them are wrong because they don't agree with me. So I enjoy instilling at least the possibility of new ideas into young heads. But for all of those of you who've been part of the community of supercomputing or high-performance computing over many years, we are at one of those truly critical turning points. And I hope I can convey that over the next few minutes. So let's start with the beginning of mankind and understand the defining moment of the genus Homo, and went over a number of species over 2.5 million years, was when our predecessors, our ancestors, invented the notion of a tool. A tool is, in one form or another, is a physical enabler that allows we as species to overcome the limitations of our physical manifestation and in fact be able to do more and work from a period where in fact in this area we as a species were largely serving the purpose of food for other species, are now at a point where we have large control over our environment and indeed expanding environments. And this is, in my view, a consequence of a slow evolution of the idea of tools, and after that, the notion of tools as means of enabling thought, not just our physical universe, but our mental universe as well. At the pre-dawn of civilization, there was even indications of this happening. In the upper right-hand corner, you have a picture of what is known as the Acheulean hammer. It wasn't the very first tool, it's the second generation of toolkit that is identified. The first, I don't even remember the name, it was associated with Homo habilis, discovered by Leakey, I think in Tanzania. I may be wrong about that. And it allowed the concentration of a force to a single point in the physical world. It allowed them to make changes, to be able to more easily access food resources from animals, and to capture those animals. If we jump forward 2.5 million years, we're at a position today where we have all recently, and within the human lifetime, invented another tool. And that tool is a supercomputer. And the supercomputer doesn't help us form or reshape our physical world. We don't kill animals and chop wood with it. Instead, we form ideas. It is, in a sense, the supercomputer is, in a sense, the hammer of the mind. And we are at that moment in the history of our species to bring that tool to bear and to help us, once again, create our future. So we jump forward a little bit, and we start to see this very intimate relationship between our gaining knowledge, let's call it science for the ease of discussion, and our development of means of doing calculations and applying calculations to our growing set of knowledge. I'm sorry I don't have photographs for these gentlemen, but they lived before the camera was invented. One of the interesting histories of our species, almost as if it were a creation myth, was the very tight coupling of the first of sciences, astronomy, or eventually cosmology, and the use of mathematical modeling and calculation. The calculation means were pretty simple, the use of abacuses and other primitive ways to count, but in fact, it was very helpful in accelerating the rate at which we could produce complex arithmetic operations. And in this image, you see Copernicus, who rediscovered, and by the way, truth in telling this story, Copernicus did in his preface identify that he recognized that the notion that he was putting forth had already been considered and discovered, if you will, 1,500 years earlier by the Greek Aristarchus. And that discovery, of course, is the heliocentric, at that time, the heliocentric universe. The notion that the sun is the center of the universe and that the earth travels around it. The fact that we've lost that fact for over 1,000 years, it is really extraordinary, although it does reoccur in the Arabic literature, in the Persian literature, about 500 years before Copernicus. Truly, the greatest astronomer before the invention of the telescope was Tycho Brahe on your right. He was able to derive such accurate measurements of the wandering stars, we call them planets, that the total amount of, do I say it, big data, was able to be analyzed, data analytics, by the third person in this picture, this is Johannes Kepler. Kepler is amazing. And this was a very primitive time. For example, sometimes he was distracted from discovering the laws of the universe by having to go and defend his mother from accusations of witchcraft. We have a lot of problems, but I don't think that's one of them right now. But what made him great was not that he found the right answer, though that amazing as that is, it was that he didn't want that to be the answer. It wasn't pure. There were notions of pure spheres and other pure objects, including the dodecahedron, my personal favorite, in which it was thought that somehow the universe would be formed by these different concentric objects. That wasn't the answer. The answer was ugly. The answer was a bunch of ellipses and even planets that didn't even move at the same speed. And yet, he used the raw data and brought his really critical mathematical reasoning, brought astronomy together with computing to get the answer which we refer to unimaginatively as Kepler's 3 laws. And they're right. To a very strong first approximation, they were right. This marriage, this merger of science or knowledge and calculation was further extended in the next century, and certainly these two gentlemen, neither of whom were very nice, by the way. The top one is Galileo Galilei, and the bottom one is Isaac Newton. Newton in his old age became the head or governor of the mint under James or Charles, I don't remember words. And he took particular pride in having executed any number of people who forged the currency. It was a hobby. But before that, of course, he took the laws that were defined by Kepler and the additional laws of mechanics, which were defined by Galileo, and put them together, and of course produced what, again, we really have to get better names, we called the three laws of Newton. So, of course, Newton's three laws were actually four laws. You'd think history could fix that over time, but they didn't. The last one being of gravitation. And with this, these equations, 300 years later, are still used to guide spacecraft that my former employer, NASA, sends to the planets, to Mars, and continues to guide Vikings 1 and 2 as they move outside the solar system as total. Science and knowledge, calculations and computing. You probably aren't as familiar with this, gentlemen. You know, history makes these things up. We can't. Okay, so this is Harlow Shapley, who managed to figure out the halo shape that forms our galaxy. I'm not joking. And he found out that the solar system was not at the center of the universe. He found out that the universe was a galaxy and that we were about 30,000 light years from its center, off in the suburbs, if you will. And there was great debate as to whether this was both true and whether the universe was only one galaxy. I'm sorry, I forgot. There we go. The calculation machines at that time had gotten fairly sophisticated, but were still electromechanical. On your left is the Hollerith machine of 1890 that was developed for the purposes of the 1890 US Census. It had gotten to the point the population was so large that every 10 years of taking the census, it took more than 10 years to calculate it by hand. This was not a winning solution. The other one is an earlier machine developed by Charles Babbage in the UK, known as the difference engine, that in fact was able to generate a wide array of tables automatically of trig functions and many other functions, at least those that could be computed from summations. And the final picture of this history that ends 2.5 million years of human conquest and the adaptation of gaining knowledge through calculation are these two gentlemen. You recognize the lower one. That's Albert Einstein. I don't know if it hit South Africa, but there was a very nice mini-series put together about Einstein's life, and it finally captured the fact that he too, on occasion, wasn't that nice a guy. It was Hubble, there we go, sorry, I'm staring at this guy, the famous picture. It was Hubble who discovered, using the Mount Wilson telescope and the calculators of the day, that no, the galaxy was not the whole universe, that there were many galaxies, and furthermore, that they were moving away. And so the final piece of this, by using Einstein's equations of general relativity and the empirical science and math used by such people as Hubble, and after whom, by the way, the Hubble telescope in orbit is named after, was able to determine that, in fact, not only are we not the center of the universe, we are way not the center of the universe. In fact, there isn't one. And that the universe is about 14 billion years old and started with the Big Bang. What you're seeing here in this picture is the afterglow of the Big Bang. That afterglow is the point in time about 380,000 years after the beginning of the universe, in which electrons and the nuclei, considering of protons and neutrons, came together and allowed light to travel through. And so now we see that light. Okay, let's jump forward. Here's another big story. Only this story is just a little bit longer than my life. And it shows a set of stages of understanding of computing and its application to science, as well as to other mission-critical problems. And here is a marriage between the way we do the calculations, the architecture, the structure of the systems that do it, and the technologies that evolved, that emerged, that allowed these new machines to be built. Now, I can go back before this period of time, but we start here with the emergence of the electronic digital stored program computer, also known as the von Neumann computer, and the slightly earlier digital electronic calculator, ENIAC, in the mid-1940s. It was made of vacuum tubes and, vacuum tubes, and also very simple primitive forms of storage. The first truly practical von Neumann architecture, I would say, others might disagree, was EDSAC, developed in Cambridge, England by Maurice Wilkes. And EDSAC ran at about 780 operations per second. That's less than 1K ops. And I didn't say flops, that was ops. Also, from the same technologies were developed in the US, the UNIVAC 1, that should be IAS. All right. You never know you made a mistake until you're standing in front of an entire crowd of people, all of whom no doubt were chuckling about they could tell that AIS should have been IAS. Yeah, I know you all got it first. This isn't the first time I showed this slide. And it's only at those most awkward, embarrassing moments. What's great is when you get so old you don't care. Vacuum tubes, transistors, core memory, putting multiple transistors on a die, SSI, small scale integration, MSI, medium scale integration. With those new classes of machines, including Seymour Cray's most famous, but neither first nor last, supercomputer, the humbly named Cray 1, and at 100 megaflops. The machine before that, Cray had also designed, with the CDC 6800s, well, 6600, 6800, and 7600, and that was at 1 megaflops. So this is like 2 orders of magnitude over the previous most spectacular machines, which was opening up whole new problems of computation that couldn't have even been imagined 10 years before. These integrated circuits reduced the power, reduced the size, reduced the cost, and increased the speed. But the technology kept growing. With large-scale integration, the class of machines that Cray had invented, the Cray 1, was no longer the optimal architecture. The vector computer, in its basic form, was no longer viable as a competitive machine. And so we went into 2 directions. One was the parallel vector processor, where many vector processors were ganged together in the same memory space, and also SIMD, sequential issue multiple data, where because LSI allowed you to combine so many elements together in one chip. Now, by the way, that technology isn't even good enough to sit in a digital watch. So, but it was an extraordinary advance. But no sooner did SIMD and SIMD arrays and PVPs come to play than the technology moved to VLSI. When VLSI happened, it kind of broke everything. In 1991, for an example, at Caltech, where I would eventually work as a researcher, it had the fastest computer in the world. 1991, the Intel, right, Intel's buying dinner, right, so we have to say Intel. But the Intel Touchstone Delta somewhere between 10 and 20 gigaflops. Now, to put that in context, this is something that filled this whole space, and it's about the speed of your laptop. This was the fastest computer in the world. I got involved a couple of years later, and how do you say this? Put together commodity clusters and brought Linux into the fray. And to our surprise, they worked, and they provided a performance to cost in most cases of greater than an order of magnitude, and at the peak, at almost a factor of 50. And so, in a few minutes, we're going to award prizes to students who are working on basically the same class of system as came out in the mid-90s, but with a technology, the integration of which has leaped forward yet again. Where are we today? It's sad. Sad and frustrating. Sad, frustrating, and disappointing. Sad, frustrating, disappointing, and difficult because we haven't come up to the next transition in paradigm. Over the last 25 years or so, using both MPPs and derivatives of Beowulf clusters, we have continued to make them more powerful and faster, and we built larger and larger versions of it. And we reached a point in 2004, 2005, when our processor cores couldn't get any faster. We could make them smaller, but we couldn't go faster. We couldn't have a faster clock rate. We couldn't have more performance, more instructions per unit cycle. We could only build them with better technology, but we couldn't make them better. And we had to move to the multi-core era. We are still in the multi-core era for the last decade and change. And the way we've done that change is that we've leveraged Moore's Law. And Moore's Law said, and it was an observation made in 1968 by Gordon Moore, who founded Intel with some other colleagues. He said, it looks like integrated circuits are going to improve in density maybe a factor of 2 or so every 2 years. And he really hit that right. Until now. Moore's Law is at an end. It's slowing down. It's gone over the top, and it's no longer feasible to expect this exponential growth, and I'm using the word correctly, most people don't, this exponential growth to continue. And it is now, at this time, that bright minds, I didn't want to say such as myself, we start looking at yet another paradigm shift. Okay, I wasn't going to show this picture, but the student with whom I was talking, we were talking about some of this history, and I mentioned a workshop in 1994, February of 94, that I was part of, and there were 4 different breakout groups, one of which was architecture. And there were about 11 or 12 people in that group, and I had the good fortune to be among those. This is an extraordinary picture. I didn't know we were doing that. We didn't know we were making history. If you'll allow me, I just want to kind of give you a sense. I've just given you a history of computing. Well, the guy in the front with the tie, that's Seymour Cray. Right? As far as any other name is concerned, that is the one that's is the same as supercomputing. I won't point them out, but let me just say that, of course, Cray is given the credit for vector processing. The young man that way, that's right. Okay, it's Craig Papadopoulos, who's a star at Intel, and Greg built the best machine of a certain class called data flow. Just above him, further to the right, is Burton Smith, who pretty much invented multi-threading. One man over is Peter Kogi, who invented processor and memory. All the way at the other extreme is Tom Blank, who built probably the best SIMD machine ever built, the MassPar 2. And yeah, if you look between Cray and Tom, you'll see myself. And yeah, I used to comb my hair the same way. back then. And I will say that I represent that approach to computing that involved clusters. Where are we today? Well, there. It's the fastest computer in the world, at least as measured by HPL, or the LINPACK benchmark. It runs at 100 petaflops, plus or minus a small percentage. Its peak is 125, its LINPACK number is 93. It has 10 million processors. 10 million processors. Now, the Cray 1 had one processor. Am I getting across to you the sense of change that's taking place? And I'm going to show you, not that, I'm going to show you this. And if you look at that red line and you look at the flat top all the way to the right, this is a Taihu Lite made in China, and it has been the #1 machine for the last 4 times that we have taken that measurement, to basically 2 years. That sawtooth line is the fastest computer of the world, measured every 6 months, and for the last 24 years or so. The bottom line is the number 500th machine. Now, this is a fantastic curve. It tells us a lot about computing, and its only problem is that it basically is a lie. Well, what's that lie? If you look between the bottom line and the red line, you would infer that there are a whole bunch of computers there, that the computers are spread over that 2 order of magnitude performance regime. They're not. This is the truth. Colleague did this analysis for me. This is our 3-world model. And the almost vertical line to our left are those big machines near that red line. The horizontal axis is basically the rank of the 500 machines. So the more space you cover on the horizontal line, the more machines you're talking about. These leadership machines, the ones we pay attention to, the ones that we expect to lead us to exascale. What, there's only half a dozen there or so. And yet that's where we put our focus. If you look at the almost horizontal red line, more than 95% of all of the high-speed computers lie on that, and the entire performance regime is only a factor of 2 to 2.5. The machine here at CHPC is very healthy position in the higher speed end of that, at about number 167 at a particular time. And then there's those few machines you can see in the middle. So really, when you talk about high performance computing and someone tells you, yes, high performance computing, 100 petaflops, you will say no. 1 petaflops or less for essentially all of the high performance computers. Now what this tells you is we got it wrong. Because what most of us work on are on that flat line, that mainstream line. And that means that the field of high performance computing is not the one that is conveyed, but rather is 2 completely different worlds, one of which is very expensive and the other of which is very useful. And they don't overlap. All right. Now, I don't remember why I'm showing you this other than to remind you of how important I am. Right. These are the baby pictures. The machine on the left was named Wiglaf, and as I was telling one of our colleagues today, it burst into flames. So, due to the bad packaging, completely my fault. The one on the right, we got rid of the bugs, we got the performance up to where we wanted, sustained performance of greater than 1 gigaflops. Yes, still less than your laptop. It won the Gordon Bell Prize for a real application. And, what was it, 96. Yeah, I know, most of you weren't born. in 96, Time magazine was coming through, and they wanted to do an article on the entire supercomputing conference. And they did a one-page article, and it was about us. Whole page about this Beowulf machine and those who put it together. It was a little insulting. The title referred to it as do-it-yourself supercomputing. Not truly flattered, but when you look at this curve, that big blotch of yellow or orange is roughly the total percentage of the 500, which are commodity clusters, are derivatives of Beowulf. And if you don't believe it, ask yourself, what operating system are you running on your supercomputer? And the answer is going to be, if it's in the top 500, you're running Linux. And you might ask, why are you running Linux? And the answer will always be, well, somebody before us did. That's a fair answer. But if you take that all the way back, Linus Torvald, graduate student, created a broken operating system in Finland. And I happened to be in a place where I needed source code for the operating system. The answer was Berkeley's BSD, but Berkeley was being sued by AT&T. And I was working for NASA, and NASA wouldn't let me use BSD, which was the right answer, because they didn't want to show favoritism in some legal case. Go for it, NASA. As a result, we decided, well, we could take what Torvalds did and we could fix it. And so we did. And for several years, almost all of the network codes run in Linux came from our project because we needed to make clusters, and clusters needed networks. So yeah, that's why you're using Linux. But the world is not the same anymore, and we're in a position, as I've already alluded, that things have to change. And one of the reasons is due to asynchrony. When clock cycle rates, I said that right, clock cycle rates go up or clock cycle times go down, the ratio of that time to the distance that a signal can pass on a semiconductor die is limited by things, the speed of light. So we're not going to fix that. We can slow it down, but we can't speed it up. And so we find that the number of cycles to do things in an ever-increasing distributed machine is more and more cycles. And worse than that is we don't know how long it's going to be. Each action can change for any number of reasons. The latencies can change, the overhead software will change, the contention, things bumping into each other, can change, and frankly, there are other issues related to parallelism and what we call starvation. So now we need a machine that doesn't even know how it's going to operate when it's performing the same program over and over. And we need an architecture that does that. Okay, if somebody else were standing on this stage and telling you, here is the future, here is beyond exascale, here is what happens when our gates are made from a few atoms. We refer to this as nanoscale. They're nanometers. How many atoms width in a nanometer? 10. And that's on a good day. If you're not building your computer out of hydrogen, recommended, don't build your computer out of hydrogen. It's going to be fewer than that. And so we are up against it. So somebody would want me to say quantum computing. Quantum computing. There are people here young enough who will probably see quantum computing be successful. I have little doubt, but there is much engineering work to be done. The theoretical work has been done for some time, for many years. But the challenge, and that thing at the bottom is a piece of niobium on top of silicon. That has to be cooled to about 20 to 40 millikelvins. Right? So if you're not into kelvins, this is like 1 degree Celsius above zero. And this is about 1/20th of one of those degrees. Now that's very hard to do, but it's doable. And so quantum computing is going to be part of the solution for certain problems, certain algorithms, when they get it working And you can see I'm standing outside an early quantum computer. This is the D-Wave machine. If you're familiar with that poor cat that Schrödinger owned, the last thing you want to do is get inside a quantum computer because you don't know whether you're going to make it out again. Quantum computing will be part of the solution, but it will not replace high-performance computing of a more conventional type because it's only good for certain classes of algorithms. It can be exponential for some, polynomial for others, but not, in fact, cannot work and do all your problems. You're not going to run Emacs on a quantum computer, although it's an interesting idea. Other things that are very exciting right now are neuromorphic computer, brain-inspired computing. We have a decent idea about how neurons work. Couldn't we build a computer like that? I can't speak for yourself, but for me, I have about a brain cavity of about 1450 cubic centimeters. I have about 89 billion neurons. Each of those neurons, on average, connect up with about 10,000 other neurons. And it only uses 20 watts, not to be confused with the 20 megawatts of our fastest machines. People smell an opportunity there. One of my favorite types of machines, which has not yet been done in a full commercial system, is a superconducting supercomputer. This is taking certain technologies, niobium being one of them, and cooling them down not to 40 millikelvins, but to a, relatively speaking, balmy 4 kelvins. When you do this, you've got no resistance. Your energy consumption drops dramatically, and your potential clock rate is between 100 and 200 gigahertz, as opposed to 2 to 4 gigahertz today. That's 2 orders of magnitude. And finally, there's this notion of processor and memory. I pointed Peter Koki out to you, and this is the one that avoids the fundamental von Neumann bottleneck. And I'll come to that in a moment. So we are at a period where we are beyond Moore's law, in part because we are asymptotically converging with nanotechnology. And we have to make a step beyond conventional practices. There are really 2 major challenges that overall we simply, in our conventional wisdom, have not overcome. One of them is that we statically schedule all of our computing. And the other is that no matter what you say, essentially all of the commercial machines, through all those generations I've mentioned, are derivatives of the original computers, of von Neumann architectures. I don't know if there's a polite way to say, people are stupid. All right? Back in the 1950s and 60s, the most precious resource in a computer was the arithmetic logic unit. It was big. When it was vacuum tubes, it was like this. When it was transistors, it was like this. I know, I've held them. And even when they were SSI and MSI, they were still the expensive, the complex components. And this went on right up until the 80s. If you look at a map of a die, a processor core die, you will find that the floating point unit is tiny. It takes up very little area. The rest of the core takes up a great deal of area, and the entire design of that core is in order to keep that tiny little FPU piece busy. Are you following me? Okay, we build the big thing that's only good at keeping a very small thing busy. Now, this is broken, deeply broken, and yet it is the single limiting factor that constrains us. What are some of the others? Well, they're on the von Neumann bottleneck. And what is that bottleneck? The memory's over here and the processors are over here. And you have to get information back and forth. That was important in the days when memory was made out of little ferromagnetic cores, and the logic was made out of transistor ALUs. But what's the logic made out of? Semiconductor. What's the memory made out of? Semiconductor. Why do we keep them separated? That's where the stupid part comes in, right? And most of the performance we lose is because, okay, speaking of stupid, is because of that connection. We need to reverse that. What's another bottleneck? Sequential instruction issue. We want parallel instruction issue. So we still, as we did in the 50s and 60s, we still do sequential instruction issue. We also require something called sequential consistency of our memory model. We want to make our computers look like they are, in fact, uniprocessors, sequential, when in fact they're not. And finally, and here's one that you probably wouldn't get, is, by the way, we use registers. Load, store. We move data from memory or through the memory hierarchy to registers. The registers are not even in the memory namespace. We translate everything into a few registers, and then we have all sorts of problems like register overflow and so on, and keeping track of all those register data. All right. By the way, the picture that's on your right is Oppenheimer, the father of the atom bomb, and on the left is von Neumann. And the machine in the back is the IAS, not the AIS. So in the last couple of minutes, and I know I'm running towards the end, I want to give you an alternative. I'd like to call it a new idea, and it is a new idea, but it's made up of many little ideas, many of which are very old, but not in our commercial machines. We call this continuum computer architecture because it asks a simple problem. If von Neumann has got everything back, what will a machine look like if we reverse everything? The first thing, we need the fastest, lowest latency, highest bandwidth communication, because that was the thing we cared least about with the von Neumann model. Then we need high bandwidth in and out of memory. Why? Because that's the thing that strangles us in all of our conventional computers. And finally, almost as an afterthought, well, we do need to do operations. So let's just stick those in. In fact, let's stick a lot of them in. In fact, let's stick billions of them in. We don't care that we don't use them very much. We care that the memory can get one whenever it needs it. And so, from a design point of view and an architecture point of view, we ask the basic question, what is the smallest discrete element that we can in fact design and integrate into a single system that will give us the largest amount of the bandwidth, the smallest amount of the latencies, and the highest capacity we can get with the memories. This little diagram you have here, I don't know how to draw it. The thing on the left is simply supposed to suggest to you that if we merge everything together into one component, and uncreatively we refer to it as a funton, yeah, don't ask. And we put it together in a system, it's even worse. It's simultac. It actually means something. And we put those together in the billions, and we put them so that they touch each other, at least at their periphery. Then we're able to achieve the quantitative characteristics that we're searching for, largely by killing the von Neumann architecture. Now, there are a number of ways that we can build this, but they all share one property, and that is tessellation. To get the best usage of semiconductor die, we want these tiny, tiny little components to be interacting with at least its nearest neighbors. There are a number of different possibilities. I show you some of them here. We've adopted this one. This is, in some ways, one of the simplest. It also provides a hierarchy, and every one of those tiny triangles is, in fact, one of these funton components. Where, you may ask, is the core? Answer, there is no core. There is, however, this conglomeration of logic and memory that are part of the same component that allow us to operate. We merge all the memory together. There's not a memory hierarchy. Almost. There aren't any registers. There aren't any processor cores. There is a global namespace. There's no distributed computing in the logical sense. And they're very easy to design. They probably, we don't have an exact number, but somewhere less than 40,000 logic gate equivalents for each of these fun times. A graduate student class can do this design in a semester, and we're doing that. So just to give you a feeling of this, imagine you have a die and you have a bunch of these funtons. That's not a very good picture on your upper left. Then you put several of these together in a stack. Stacking dies has already been done in the high bulk memory, for an example. Okay, this is where I sort of lied. Then you stick a DRAM on top of that stack. And at the very bottom, you have some optical communication. You put those on boards and you stack the boards. And then you stack the stack of boards. We've done a lot of the analysis and we get this. We've used today's technology of semiconductors. I'm not going to drag you through all of this, but let me just point out a couple of things. Of course, I can't even read it. Oh, there we go. No, go back. There we go. All right. So here, using existing fabrication processes today, we found a number of different design points in which we could work and decide what the performance characteristics would be. On your right, you'll see one green bar, and that's with one technology, we should be able to get something in excess of, and forgive me, I still can't see it. Okay, almost 10 billion. How big a system? This is what we call a cube. That's 1 cubic meter, 10 billion funtons. So, what does this mean? I'm going to finish with this slide. It means that we're looking at a possibility in the next few years, and I don't mean few as a lot of years. The expectation is that China will have an exaflops machine in 2020. The US is pretending to have one in 2021. Let them dream. Using very old techniques. Europe is moving in that direction with 2 projects, one of them ARM-based. I'm pleased to see that. And the Japanese that build the most balanced machines will be somewhere in the 2021 to 23 time frame. I don't know which. Here's on the column on your right. This is the fastest computer in the world, Taihu Lite, which I showed you before, operating at almost 1.5 gigahertz, which is fairly modest in this case. It takes up about half of 1,000 square meters. Yeah, do that in your head. That's big. Okay? And it provides 125 petaflops. In a 25 square meter continuum computer architecture, 25, that's 5 meters by 5 meters. We can put a supercomputer built on the concepts that I've talked about, and there it is. Peak performance of almost 10 exaflops. All right, 10 exaflops versus 100 petaflops. The memory, the DRAM memory on the Simultac is 10 times as much as the DRAM memory in Taihu Lite. Taihu Lite uses a static scratchpad memory. I actually think that's a right thing to do. Not quite the way they're doing it, but it was a good try. And you're scaring people. The active memory in the Taihu Lite is over 5 exabytes in the entire system. Ours will be almost 2,000 exabytes. Now, the memory capacity is less than one would like, and we're looking at that. But the other properties blow everything else away. And this project can be done within the next couple of years. I'm going to stop here, but I hope I have left you with an understanding of the importance of computing, the history, the evolution, its application to human knowledge, and the realization that as we improve the technology, we improve the tools and the tools for thinking correspondingly. But we are now at a point where we need another paradigm shift, and quantum computing isn't ready yet. In the neo-digital age, the age of semiconductor at the end of Moore's law, relinquishing the limitations of von Neumann architecture that's dominated our field for 60 years, by just letting that go and thinking, we can leapfrog future computing in a very few years. And here I don't have a slide, and I wouldn't want to be caught even saying this. Is that the end? I thought it was. I'm actually on record as having said we, all of us, will never get to zeta flops. I was wrong. We know how to get to zeta flops. I hope I have a chance to talk about that in the future. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to address you.